therefore, and I know people say don't stay together for the children. I say, yes, stay together for the children, but get help. Get help. I think everybody deserves a second chance, maybe a third chance. You're talking about something as important as the development of a child. And, children need both that male and female figure. I'm not interested really in getting into the dynamics of many of our family dynamics that we have today. We have so many. You have two mothers, two fathers. You have people who are non-binary. We don't know, really. We might know as far as lesbians or gays go. There might be some research on that. How, if at all, the lack of, the male or the female in their life affects them greatly. That's something I need to look at. I think that's interesting. But because I don't know enough about it, I don't really want to talk about it right now. I'm saying in general, your heterosexual, this is what the majority of your research is going to be looking at, the heterosexual relationships. I think that that would be another interesting podcast. And so I may put that on my list of things to research. But again, I don't know that much about it. I don't know that there's been a ton of studies on it, but if there have been, I am interested in knowing what that says. It can be incredibly relevant, especially considering that we have more, oh gosh, what's the word? Alternative lifestyles than ever before in our history. So how does that affect our children? What is happening to them? Are they perfectly fine? As long as they have loving, caring people in their life, are they perfectly fine? I'm going to make a hypothesis that I think, yeah, if you've got two men raising children and they both love each other and they have a positive home life, I can't imagine why that would be devastating to a child. I don't think it would be. Same thing with if they have two mothers. As long as they love each other and they care about the children and they're productive members of society, there's no abuse, no neglect, all those things that we know. I think that's fine. That's my hypothesis. And I mean, I've been around children who have, two fathers, two mothers, and the children are great. I mean, they have I can't think of any that I've ever taught or observed or worked with who had parents in a different, marriage situation who were particularly stood out to me in any way. So that's my hypothesis. Hickey found that among a group of 62 male serial killers that 48% faced some kind of rejection by either parent or another important person in life, and that rejection is devastating. You have people who are 90 years old and they're still talking about being rejected by their, father when they were 2 years old. It never goes away. Never goes away. There's always some damage, but, I think we can work together and lessen the effects of this damage. Apart from rejection, other psychological factors such as childhood humiliation, neglect, early adoptions, and abandonment during childhood have been found to relate to serial murder. The three men who are the target of this study, we know, Gary Ridgway, he was humiliated by his mother. He was neglected. He felt abandoned. But he really stressed how humiliated that his mother made him. And so I feel like his mother is the one who set into motion his desire to control, his desire to kill, have that ultimate control over a person. I have no reservations in saying that I believe his mother was a major contributor in his decision to kill people. Remember, he was married also, couple of times at least. 2 I know that I can remember out off the top of my head. So he had relationships outside of his, serial killing. He again had that double life. But I'd really blame his mother and probably some other environmental factors. He was a bedwetter for a long period of time, and she humiliated him about that consistently, even when he was much, much older. And so if you don't think that those kind of words hurt, words are so painful. Words can be what literally make you or break you as a person. Because a lot of times we believe what we constantly hear. And if you hear all the time that you're stupid and you are disgusting and you're, a horrible person and no one will ever love you, you'll never get a woman, you'll never have a wife, you'll never have a husband. When we hear that consistently enough, we believe it. So the words that we put out into this world should always be uplifting and positive when we're dealing with children. When we're dealing with anybody, really. But my focus in this particular case is children. I think we should be kind to everybody because we don't know what people are going through. Again, that stems from empathy, though, right? If you don't have empathy, you typically don't care what's happening to another person. You are just more concerned with your emotions and your feelings and your desires. So teaching empathy, incredibly important. Research also supports the notion that physical and psychological abuse contribute to the development of serial killing. We know that. Cleary and Luxembourg, in their study of more than 60 serial killers, found that a prevalent part of serial killers' childhood consisted of physical and or psychological abuse. Further research studying the impact of childhood abuse and neglect on adults who became serial killers concluded that adults who were emotionally, physically, and sexually abused during their childhood were 3 times more likely than non-abused adults to act extremely violently during adulthood. Come on, people. This is how important it is. I'm not saying that, we find somebody, these children who are being abused, and you pull them out of the home and you stick them in foster care. There's damage there as well, but let me tell you, there's a greater risk if we leave them with that family where they're emotionally, physically, and sexually abused. Nothing's good about this. There's no scenario that's great here. But I think that we have to determine what's best, what is going to be in the best interest of our children. And if it's removed from the home, then it's removed from the home. And why the court system wants to put a child back with that parent that's abusive, I think on paper it sounds good, but I think in reality it's a bunch of crap. I've told you my brother and his wife, they have foster children, they have children they've adopted, and they are treated just like any other child in their family. They're loved, they're cared for, they get to go, have experiences that normal families do, vacations and fun things like that. And I know that's not the case in some cases it's very different, but certainly these children are better off in a home where they're loved and cared for consistently than back where they're from, where they were starved, didn't know where their next meal was coming from, they were abused many, many different ways, those type of things. Well, I think, I think the court, that's part of my issue with the court system and the early childhood or the, child protective services. Their mission is always to get them back into their parents' home. I think that can be very dangerous. Kessner and McHenry discovered evidence for the theory that parent-child attachments influence violent behavior. Remember when I mentioned attachment earlier? It's that attachment theory. Their results showed that individuals who developed insecure and fearful attachment styles were more likely to be violent. The childhood experiences of serial killers would almost certainly lead to the development of these non-secure attachment styles. It goes hand in hand. These processes would likely lead to difficulty in forming relationships and to the development of loneliness in both childhood and adulthood. And when we say loneliness, we're not talking, we most of the time we think of loneliness as being, I am by myself in this house, no one's around me, I don't have anybody to talk to, I'm lonely. There are many different ways you can be lonely. You can be in a room full of people and still be lonely. You can be with your family and still be lonely. It's psychological. So loneliness for me has there's quite a few different definitions of loneliness. If they felt rejected by their parents, they may never ever understand anything other than loneliness. They don't attach to anything. They don't attach to anything. And I'm not saying they don't get married or have relationships. They do, but they're not successful. Many serial killers who did have lives, normal lives outside of their serial killing, end up divorced because you can't fake a lot of this stuff. You can't fake it and make it. So it's going to come out in the wash eventually. These processes would likely lead to difficulty in forming relationships and to the development of loneliness. Loneliness experienced by most serial killers can be counted as a contributing factor to the motivation of controlling victims. Gary Ridgway. Defining loneliness as a feeling and a state of separation from others, and suggested that there exists a link between loneliness and violent and antisocial behavior. Based on their case reports, they concluded that serial killers who have experienced limited positive interactions or have faced rejection, neglect, or abandonment have indulged in antisocial and violent behaviors. The pattern of abuse and abandonment may also lead to the development of mental illness. Weatherby, Buller, and McGinnis suggested a substantial relationship between mental disorders and violent crime. Not surprised about that. Silva, Long, and Ferrari proposed a link between autism spectrum disorder and serial killing. However, various follow-up studies suggest that people with ASD are not likely and are maybe less likely to commit violent crimes as compared to the general population. And a study suggested a new diagnosis of criminal autistic psychopathy as a subcategory of Asperger's syndrome, which is not even called Asperger's syndrome anymore. But we know someone who would maybe normally have an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis, they're high functioning autistic. I've worked with a lot of children who are autistic, and I think certainly I think anybody has the potential to become a serial killer if they're put in the right environment, or if they're born with a certain, that gene, that if you believe that there's a gene, or they have some sort of predisposition to violent behavior. But I don't believe that just because someone has autism anywhere on that spectrum that they're more likely to become a serial killer. I just don't believe that. Nonetheless, Fitzgerald suggested a new diagnosis of the criminal autistic psychopathy as a subcategory of Asperger's. Weatherby and others further proposed that schizophrenics' inability to identify emotional facial expressions, among many other symptoms, influences social functioning, thus increasing the likelihood of criminal behaviors. I'm going to pause here and talk about something that's incredibly important. When we're talking about early childhood foundational skills, foundational knowledge in our classrooms, pre-service teachers in our classrooms in higher ed, we talk a lot about attachment. We talk a lot about infants and the importance of that relationship between the mother and father and the child. Obviously, the mother is that main attachment because that child is born of that woman. So they should have the absolute tightest bond of anyone else on this earth. And it shouldn't change, but, oftentimes it does. That's why we see these issues. But there's many, many studies one of the most popular studies that I talk about every semester. It's just foundational.